Yeah, so today we are very lucky to have 4 presenters, Lisa Herrera, Claire Pinkett, Frances Clark, and Caroline Pendleton. They are all from ISSofBC, and so I'll just introduce the 4 of them and then let them get started. Lisa taught in the LINC ELSA program at ISS for 15 years and is currently Lead Instructional Coordinator. She's also a CLB Lead Trainer for BC and a PBLA Regional Coach for the national implementation of PBLA. Claire is an Instructional Coordinator for the ISSofBC LINC program. Her responsibilities include curriculum development and supporting instructors creating skill-building CLB lessons. She has more than 25 years experience in TEAL. Frances is an Instructional Coordinator for the LINC program at ISSofBC. She has over 10 years of experience in ESL and LINC as an instructor and as a curriculum developer. And Caroline has 24 years experience in ESL as an instructor, curriculum and resource developer, tester, and TESOL trainer. Currently, she's an Instructional Coordinator for the ISSofBC LINC program as well.
This workshop should be suitable to anyone who is using task-based teaching with the CLB standard. Obviously, this is about CLB lesson planning, so you need to be doing CLBs. So these are the things that we're going to cover today. We're going to start with defining a CLB lesson, as we call it, and then we're going to go through step by step how we approach and analyze a CLB task using a web tool. And then we'll go over what a written out CLB lesson looks like. After that, it'll be your turn to practice analyzing a CLB task. At ISSofBC, we have been asking new teachers to submit what we call a CLB lesson every month. And this has been our practice since 2008. So looking at CLB lessons that were submitted, we realized that teachers were making similar mistakes. And so we developed a 3-hour hands-on workshop to help teachers understand how to create a CLB lesson. So for example, on the slide, you see 2 very common mistakes that teachers make when trying to plan a CLB lesson. They think in terms of the day-to-day lesson rather than the steps to work toward a CLB task. We also realized that the approach that we and our teachers were taking was part of what was causing the problems in what teachers were producing as CLB lessons. So this, as you see on the slide, was our previous approach to CLB lesson planning. We would consider the theme or the topic to be taught, we'd find relevant materials from available resources, and we plan activities. All the steps you'd take in day-to-day lesson planning. And then when we had the lesson done, we'd check with the CLB document to see what tasks had been covered in the planned lesson. So as you can imagine, this approach doesn't work. Not when what you're trying to end up with is this, which is a plan to cover all the knowledge and strategies that students have to learn and practice in order to be able to do the CLB task. So looking at this definition, you can see that what we call a CLB lesson is like one stream of a module plan. So those of you who are using module plans, particularly in PBLA, what we call a CLB lesson is like one stream of a module plan written out into activities and making sure that it includes a lot of practice of the components of the task, as well as of the task itself. So for us, a CLB lesson has always concluded with an assessment of the task, which is useful with the direction that LINC is moving in. Once we better understood where we were trying to get to, we changed our approach to CLB lesson planning. This is now the approach we ask teachers to take. We begin with the CLB document. From a needs assessment, we consider which CLB tasks can be addressed within the topic. We analyze the CLB task, and we create a series of lessons to build skills towards the CLB competency. Okay, so that's enough of the background. Let's now get into actually planning a CLB lesson. I'm now going to turn the mic over to Frances.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everybody. So we're going to on here, sorry. Here we go. We're going to get right to the heart of CLB lesson planning, which is analyzing the CLB task. We don't have time to go too deeply into choosing an appropriate task, but very quickly, how we do it is, with PBLA, you will do a needs assessment with your students and find out what real-world tasks students are trying to accomplish. Once you know what those real-world tasks are, you can then go to the CLB document for your CLB level and see which competencies apply to those tasks. From there, you can decide on the specific task that you're working towards that fits within the CLB parameters of that level. And so once you have an appropriate CLB task, you need to take it apart for all the elements that students need to be able to be successful at the tasks. So in order to understand the components of a CLB task, it's necessary to consider all the knowledge and strategies that are necessary for the task. So this is page Roman numeral 8 of the CLB document, and it describes the parts of the CLB tasks. So we'll start with pragmatic knowledge. So an example of pragmatic knowledge would be language for making requests. So if you were looking at this for your class, you would consider the differences between a formal request to your boss and a casual request to a friend or a neighbor, for example. Is it socially appropriate to always request to borrow your neighbor's tools? Is it culturally appropriate to make a request directly, or should you first engage in some small talk? So those are some of the things that you would consider when you're looking at pragmatic knowledge. Okay, and then there's organizational knowledge, and this is an area that many teachers tend to focus on. The vocabulary and the grammar, the mechanics for writing. But organizational knowledge is just one part of what students need to know and be able to do successfully for a task. So it's important to focus some time on it, but it's not the meat of the lesson. There's other aspects that you need to consider. Okay. We also have strategic competence, and so for every task, there are strategies to manage conversation that need to be explicitly taught. So some examples of strategic competence are things like clarifying and confirming strategies, scanning for details, and note-taking skills. And lastly, you want to consider the background knowledge aspect of tasks, and this can be quite confusing for teachers. So this is knowledge about or content knowledge for the specific task. So teaching this does not give students the language skills, but it's important background. It should really just make up a very small part of the CLB lesson. The CLB lesson should really be focusing on language. So an example of this would be if it was a month of where the theme was health, you might be making sure that the students knew the difference between a doctor and a counselor and a psychologist. That's background content knowledge. Okay. All right, I'm going to pass the mic over to Claire now.
Thanks, Frances. First, I'd like to apologize for the way my voice sounds right now. I've caught a terrible cold, and, well, at least I'm not breathing on you all. I think I'm giving a whole new definition to the word computer virus here. Okay, to illustrate what we've been talking about, let's take a look at a specific CLB task. To do this, we're going to map out the CLB using a web tool. We found that using a web tool can be very helpful. It allows teachers to understand all the components of a task that need to be reviewed and or taught, and more importantly, practiced, in order for students to gain necessary skills and be successful. We like to use a web because it's visual and you can just scribble it out on a piece of paper while you're sitting in a coffee shop or something like that. There are other ways to do this, of course. We just find this one works really well. To show you what we mean, let's create a web for a particular CLB task. Let's look at the example of speaking CLB 8-4, sharing information and small group discussions or meetings. If you have a CLB document, this is on page 59 of the revised document. The CLB task we've chosen is participating in a meeting. This could be any kind of meeting, a strata meeting, a PAC meeting, a formal business meeting, and so on. The particular lesson that we're going to describe was actually inspired by a student who came to class one day very concerned about an upcoming condominium strata special general meeting at which residents would be voting on some costly property repairs. The student, understandably so, was worried not only about understanding the language at the meeting, but also understanding the process and procedure for this type of meeting. As noted earlier, the first place we turn is the CLB document. Let me just zoom in here a bit for you. Let's make it a little. Am I not zooming in? There we go. Okay, so we look at the specific competency as well as the strengths and weaknesses noted in the profile of ability. We consider additional knowledge and strategies that might be important for the task. For speaking CLB 8, we can check the knowledge and strategies page, which is on page 59 of your document. Now, it's important to remember that this knowledge and strategies page is for the whole stage, not per level. So we're looking at CLB 5 to 8 when we look at this page. Okay. Of course, participating in a meeting could be part of a complete module approach that includes reading, writing, and listening components. But since we're only assessing the speaking CLB, we're going to focus on the speaking components. So what are those components? The first thing we should consider is any background knowledge that might be important. Now, since we said this was a formal meeting, having an understanding, or at least a basic understanding, of Robert's Rules of Order would be important. Understanding, that's also known as parliamentary procedure. So giving students a background there. And also having them understand the assigned roles, that the chairperson is the one who speaks until the floor is given to someone else, and that there is protocol. So this is very important for them to be successful in the task. Okay. Now we take a look at the functional and sociolinguistic knowledge or pragmatic knowledge needed to complete this task. For a student to be successful, they would need to be able to ask relevant questions, to gather, analyze information, be able to express and qualify opinions, feelings, doubts, and concerns, and to hold or share the floor, draw others out, and to thank people. These are just some examples. How about the structure, vocabulary, and pronunciation, or grammatical and textual knowledge required for the student to be successful in this task? There's indirect or polite questions, lots of vocabulary for meetings, things like making a motion or seconding a motion, a motion carried. They may need to have a good understanding of conditionals so that they can talk about consequence. If this happens, then that's the result. Words for sequencing, comparing, contrasting, etc. I think you maybe get the idea. Finally, what strategies are needed to manage communication? The ability to summarize, paraphrase, and confirm using intonation correctly, overall fluency, the ability to apologize, explain misunderstandings, etc. Okay, so now you've seen an example. I'm going to turn the presentation over to Caroline, and she's going to walk you through an actual lesson.
Okay, so thanks, Claire. Can everybody hear me? Is that working okay? Once we know all the relevant components of the task, we can create the CLB lesson. this is where we should be here. Okay. At ISSofBC, this is what our CLB lessons include. So this is turning the web into a lesson. First of all, we set the context. We review components that we feel students have already mastered. We teach new components, practice the new components, integrate all these components into a final task, and then we assess the final task. Remember, and this is really crucial to understand, that we're not talking about a single lesson that's meant to be done in just one day. It's a series of lessons. And these lessons cover all the components, all of those things that Claire just went over in the bubbles in the previous slides. So the teacher might spread this learning over a week or 2 weeks or even a month, depending on the complexity of the task. So here is a very brief lesson summary that's based on the web that Claire just went over with you, and on what at ISSofBC we expect to be included in a CLB lesson. Don't worry about trying to read the lesson right now. We're going to be posting it on the Realize forum. So on this page of the lesson, you can see that we've explicitly laid out the CLB competency, which is here, which is what Claire mentioned earlier. Which is speaking for CLB 8, number 4, sharing information, small group discussions or meetings. And the criteria is also spelled out, and it comes from the indicators of ability and the profile of ability, and that's a bit tricky to read, but it's back here. So when you look on the Realize forum later, you can have a better look at that. The specific CLB task here is that they participate in a formal meeting, such as a community meeting. So first of all, we introduce the task in context to students. This is to establish why the task is important or useful for them to learn. For example, in this class, the teacher decided to show a YouTube video of a chaotic business meeting, and then afterwards discuss that. It's kind of a segue into the task. Then we move on to the components of the task that we consider to be a review. We expect students to know them, or we've already taught them to them recently. For example, here, reviewing gambits for expressing opinions, feelings, doubts, and concerns, expressing opposition to or support for a stand or a solution. So these would be review activities. Continuing on with the lesson here, as it progresses, we move from review activities into more explicit teaching to cover each component and to provide practice, of course. So these are what we call in our lesson language learning activities. And for example, referring to the bubbles here, there's explicit teaching and then practicing of meeting vocabulary, Robert's Rules of Order, and also with some, let's say some grammar, nouns versus gerunds, for example. Other skill development has to do with summarizing, paraphrasing, confirming information, doing that verbally, of course, because we're going to be assessing this as a speaking task, and of course, working on fluency. Note, of course, that each component here is not taught and practiced in an abstract way, but in the specific context of the task that we're working towards. So there's no assumption that students can transfer skills from abstract to concrete. They learn and practice specifically what they need to know and do for this task that we are going to assess them on. So each teacher is likely to do this differently. This is of course is only one possible version of a lesson that covers the relevant components. Other lessons might emphasize different parts or have very different activities to accomplish the same objectives. There might be more or less review, more or less teaching, depending on the needs of the class. Students might require more practice after each step to be sure they've really learned and integrated the knowledge and strategies. So each teacher is going to do this differently, but what's important to remember is that the components, what is included in that web that Claire went over, that is the same. This is the last part of the lesson. So we conclude with activities that explicitly allow students to practice the whole task together rather than working on the individual components. Then, and only when we feel the majority of the students are ready to be assessed, do we offer the final assessment task. So it's good to remember that it takes as long as it takes to get to this point. The teacher, while observing and teaching, may realize that the learners need more practice with one component, and so she may revise her lesson and spend longer on this. So this is an example for you. I'm going to pass it over to Frances now.
Okay, so that was CLB lesson planning from start to finish, very briefly or quickly. So we really wanted to give you an opportunity to work on the most important part of CLB lesson planning, which is analyzing a CLB task. So for those of you who are doing PBLA, this is what you're doing when you're module planning, and what you're going to be working on this afternoon would be one stream of a module plan. So we wanted to give you an example at a lower CLB level. So we're going to take a look at a CLB 3. We decided to do form filling because we found that some teachers have trouble understanding that form filling actually consists of multiple components. Because of the nature of form filling, we felt we couldn't just do the reading or writing aspect separately. So we put them together, although they are two separate CLB tasks. Okay, so here is a glimpse of all the components to these two CLB tasks that we found. In the next few slides, we're going to ask you to tell us how you think each of these bubbles can be filled in. Okay, so I'm going to move it on over to Claire at this point, and she'll guide you through.
Thank you, Frances. So this is the hands-on portion of our workshop today. So let's see a show of hands using the hands up tool on the left side of your screen. How many of you have printed out or downloaded this slide already? Do we have anybody that's done it? Oh, quite a few. Good. All right. If you have not downloaded the previous slide, don't worry. You can write your answers into the public chat forum, and we'll go over some of those ideas. And also, as Frances mentioned, or I think maybe Caroline mentioned, all of the lesson plans and slides will be available later on the Realize forum. Okay, let's start with the background knowledge to complete these CLB tasks. As you recall earlier, I showed you an example of CLB 8. We chose that one for the example because of the complexity and the ability to mine so much useful information from the particular CLB competency. This time, as Frances mentioned, we've put together the reading and the writing for CLB 3 because it's very difficult to fill in a form without being able to read the form first. The specific context we've chosen is filling in a form in a medical clinic. What kind of background knowledge do you think students need to know for this task? So please type your ideas into the chat forum now. I am going to pause for a few minutes, so don't worry, my audio has not cut out. I'm being told to turn to the next slide. There we go. All right, so I'll give you a minute to type in your ideas. What do you think the background knowledge would be required for doing this task? Okay, so I see Jeff says that they need to know their address. Of course, if they don't know their address, it's going to be very challenging to fill in a form. Okay, maybe let me help you out for a minute here. Visualize the situation. Before we get into the actual activities in the classroom, think about the last time you went to the doctor. Maybe you visited a family doctor or went to a walk-in clinic. What was the procedure? What did you do when you first walked in the door? What did the office look like? I see Della says to report to the front desk. Yes, I think reporting to the front desk would be very important, and knowing that there is a sequence involved, that you don't, if somebody else is already at the desk, you don't just walk up and present your information. So here's what we've come up with. We think it would be important for students to understand the procedure in a doctor's office, such as going to the front desk, presenting your care card, or possibly in some cases taking a number and sitting down and waiting until you're called to the desk to present your information. And of course, the importance and use of information on forms, knowing your complete address, making sure that you use your complete name, and possibly making sure that students know to use their legal name, the name that's on their care card, rather than just the name that they use in class. Sometimes that's different. Okay, now let's look at the functional and sociolinguistic knowledge students might need for this task. How would you fill in these bubbles? I'll give you a hint if you're struggling here. You can go to your CLB document and look at page 81 and page 117 for ideas. And again, I'm going to pause for a few minutes. Don't worry, my audio has not cut out. You can type your answers into the chat forum now. Oh, I don't see too many answers popping up. Are you going to be like my students and just wait for me to give you the answers? So again, remember we're looking at the functional and sociolinguistic knowledge that the students would need. Things like the layout of forms. Okay, let's take a look at what we came up with. Does your web look similar to ours? Did you come up with some of the same ideas? Again, this was taken from the revised CLB document. If you have the document in front of you, you can go back to, what page did I say that was on? I think it was page 81 and 117. Thank you, Lisa. All right. All right. So we've got writing conventions for addresses, phone numbers, etc. I was really surprised recently by a CLB4 class that was writing their phone number out without any spaces, just all 10 digits together. So understanding the grouping of numbers when it comes to things like addresses and phone numbers would be very important thing to teach and to practice before actually filling in a form. Okay, so next, let's look at the grammatical and textual elements of this task. What do you think students might need to know to be successful in this task? Okay, what activities and exercises would you need to review, teach, and practice in order for students to be successful? So I'll give you a minute to think about that. Right, we're looking at the organizational knowledge now. Capitals and spacing, definitely. Sometimes forms ask you to write in block letters. What does block letters mean? Reading words such as last name, family name, surname. Oh, Gil says in some cultures, the first name is written last and the last name is written first. Learners need to know the difference between first and last name. Very, very important, especially on medical forms. Well, pretty much any form, banking too. Writing on the line. Yes, I have a number of Farsi speakers in the class that really struggle with the writing on the line. So we do a lot of extra practice, and some of those students get extra take-home work to practice writing on the line. Okay, let's look at some of our suggestions. similar to what a lot of you have put up in the chat. You know, writing, capitalization, writing personal information, knowing how to write your address, knowing how to write your phone number, reading personal information words. Some forms use the word last name, some use the word family name, some use the word surname. Knowing that vocabulary would be key to being successful in this task. Finally, let's consider some of the strategies for managing communication for this task. What strategies do you think belong in these bubbles? So what's the strategic competence here? I'll give you a few minutes to type in your answers. I see Nazgul has mentioned clarifying, a very important strategy, asking clarifying questions when you don't understand something. Self-correction. Yes, Simon, I agree. You know, everybody makes a mistake when they're nervous. Knowing how to correct the information, especially if the student sees the receptionist or the person at the desk recording incorrect information. So, mentions asking questions if form is not clearly understood. Yes, some forms can be very confusing, and although we may have practiced looking at several different forms in the classroom, you know, not every form looks the same, and each office handles forms in their own way. So making sure to ask questions if you don't understand. Double checking, yes, going back and proofreading what you filled in. That is a strategy that many students have not yet mastered. I'm sure many of you have students in your class that are, teacher, I'm finished. And of course, you know, reading skills, we need to look at skills like scanning for information. We've had lots of great ideas. Let's look at what we've come up with. So under reading, we've said scanning for specific information. A lot of forms have sections that say for office use only, you know, knowing not to fill in that section, being able to scan the form and see which areas are relevant, to be able to ask for meaning and clarification, which we talked about a little while ago. If the form is unfamiliar and there are words or sections that are not easily understood, being able to ask the receptionist or the frontline worker what the meaning of those words is. And of course, copying for spelling. Right? Maybe maybe the student knows they have a particular allergy. They've looked it up in their translation dictionary, or somebody has told them the word in English and they've copied it onto a piece of paper knowing that they've copied it correctly. Okay, so now we have a completed web tool that shows all the components of these two CLB tasks. You can see that even simple CLB tasks, there can be many components that need to be reviewed and or taught and practiced before assessment can take place. My colleague Caroline is now going to show you how to turn this web into an actual lesson.
Thanks, Claire. So in terms of turning this into a series of lessons, remember that this is what we consider at ISSofBC. And this is the same slide that we showed you previously for the CLB 8 lesson. So just to recap, we set the context, review the components, all of those things in the bubbles that Claire was going over, the ones that the students we feel have already mastered. We teach ones that we think are new for students. Practice these new ones, integrate all the components into the final task, and then after that, assess the final task. So, and here's just one version of what the series of lessons might look like based around the web that you just did for CLB 3, reading and writing. On this page of the lesson, you can see that we've laid out the CLB competency up here in the gray bubble, and which is reading CLB 3, number 3, and writing also number 3 competency, getting things done, simple formatted texts and forms. Again, like in the CLB 8 lesson we showed earlier, each of these include the criteria, which is taken from the indicators of ability and the profile of ability. And the teacher has written these out back here. It's hard for you to see right now. I don't know if I can zoom that in a bit. There you go. But later, after the presentation, this will be posted, like we said, on the forum, so you can read it in more detail. So the task is clearly stated. Fill out a simplified form with personal information for a medical services provider. And like in the CLB 8 lesson, the task is introduced in context to students. So we want to clarify why it's important for them to learn so they realize that. And in this case, the teacher chose a video of patients at a clinic interacting with the receptionist about filling out a form, and use that kind of like a segue into the lesson. So after that, we do what we call language review activities, reviewing the components that we think students should already know. And for example, here, one review activity is reviewing and practicing reading personal information words. Some of you in the chat were mentioning first name, last name, address, etc., those kind of things. Continuing with the lesson. So for this specific lesson, another language review activity for the students involves writing conventions for names, addresses, and phone numbers. So how do we write them in English? The conventions are different, perhaps different from compared to other languages. Also, we get into specific teaching of components. We've moved from review to specific explicit teaching of the components, all of those bubbles that Claire went over. So, and we call those language learning activities. So here, for example, we teach some vocabulary related to common illnesses that students might see on medical forms. We also teach the common format of basic forms, where things are usually found on the forms, and the reading skill of scanning for specific information, specifically teaching that as a skill. How do you scan? Students need to learn how to do that. And copying for spelling, as Claire mentioned. We teach common form filling conventions like writing on the line. Somebody in the chat mentioned that. Not under the line, for example. Printing using block letters, etc. After explicit teaching of these and practice, we give students a lot of practice. Then once the teacher feels that these components have been covered and practiced, she has the class incorporate all of that learning, and the students practice filling in a complete form. And then finally, the students are assessed on that. So an assessment task is done at the end. So it's important to remember for the assessment that the form used in the assessment is not the same form as the one used for practicing. They will be very similar, of course, but not the same. So just to recap and remind you that, as with the CLB 8 lesson, this is only one possible CLB lesson sequence. Each teacher will do this differently. But the components, all of the stuff in the bubbles, all the things in the web, all of that will be the same. So I'd like to just hand it over to Lisa now.
Thank you, Caroline. So we're just about to open the floor to questions. But first of all, we'd like to really thank everyone for participating in this workshop. It was really great to see the chat box filling up with people's ideas of how to fill in those bubbles. We hope that this has been useful for you, and I just want to remind you that we will be posting those written out lesson plans in the Realize forum if you want to come back and pick them up a little later, probably today or tomorrow, so that you can actually read them. And then you'll also have those webs. So you'll see the webs, and then you'll see how we turned those into lesson plans. And of course, just reiterating that the lesson plans that we're giving you are ones that is just an example of how it's possible to turn all that knowledge and strategies into a series of lessons for students to learn the knowledge and strategies and skills that they need for the task. So we'd now like to open the floor to questions, if anybody has any. Thank you, Rita. She says, excellent information. Although I have stage 2 learners, the process is quite applicable. Thank you. The process should be applicable for any CLB level, because the idea is that you're just taking the CLB task and you're analyzing it for all the components. So hopefully it's applicable to any level. Got a lot of thank yous coming up. Anybody have any questions? I'm getting the sense that we explain things so well that there's not any questions coming up. Christine says that she really liked the web tool a lot. And Sylvia agrees. I like the web tool for teaching and learning. Marilyn says it was very clear and useful. Yeah, I'm not seeing any questions. And Mary says there weren't any questions earlier. Maureen says, thank you. I like going about this in an organized way. Yes, this is what we hope, is that we've laid it out in a really clear and sort of step-by-step way, which is why we called it demystifying. We're hoping to sort of take out that confusion about where you're supposed to start and what you're supposed to do. Anonymous says, thanks for demystifying things. Oh, that's Zoe. Thank you, Zoe. And Jeff says, extremely helpful, much appreciated. Well, actually, I'd love to stand here and read out more compliments to us. Wait, I think I see a question. As a supply teacher at the moment, how can I make sure that I am following the CLB strategies, especially when I have not met the teacher I'm supplying for? That's a very good question. If it's a one-day kind of thing that you're doing a substitute for, it's very difficult, as you can tell, to do a CLB lesson. What you may want to do is check with that teacher and find out what CLBs they're working towards to find out what component you may be able to address in that day. And if it's just one day, you might just be reviewing something that the teacher has already addressed or giving the students a chance to practice. Okay. Simon asked, is this CLB lesson plan going to be on Tutela? Oh, we hadn't actually thought about that, but I guess there's no reason that we couldn't. I think we'd put it on with the bubbles so that people could see that that's what it's actually related to. We don't want people to think that this is the only way to do this kind of lesson, but that it's related to those bubbles. Question from Intercultural Association. How long does it take for a teacher to prepare this? Oh, there's the money question. I think that when you're first starting out with this, I think all our teachers would agree that it does take a lot of thought and time to actually work through this process. As it becomes more natural and you sort of know your CLB levels more, and so you sort of know the components of the task more, they sort of come to your mind a little faster. It does get a little faster, but it does take time. And the whole idea with this is you've got the module planned out. When you address this later, you may not do exactly the same lesson, but you've got all the components, so you know what to address. So hopefully it'll be easier later on. Mary says, Louise, any secret to relate this to PBLA? So the relation is the module planning. That's really what it is. These are the steps that you would do to get to that assessment task at the end. Also, tips for dividing the lesson into one-day session from Louise Green. That's a good question, and really I think that's one thing that really depends on the teacher. It depends on your class. I would not plow through a whole bunch of teaching and reviewing in one day. I think that students can get quite tired doing that. So I think you sort of have to judge your students and see how much they can take on one day, and if they need to do review again on the next day, for instance, to make sure that everything is solidified. So the whole idea is that you've got the components, and then you're sort of deciding as a teacher the best way to sort of roll that out in your class. And Michelle K says, and finding materials to fit with each component. Ooh, that's another difficult question. We certainly have found that at this point, a lot of commercial materials don't really work with what we need. We find that it's actually a lot faster to make some of these materials ourselves, particularly, I would have to say, listening. CLBs, it's often a lot easier to just make those ourselves. But I do have faith and confidence that as more people are doing this, that the publishers are going to see what we need, and there'll be more materials coming out that are ready-made. And Caroline reminds that it also depends on the complexity of the task. And Claire reminds that we do not expect a complete CLB lesson in a 3-hour period. A CLB lesson can take several days. And Michelle says, exactly. Louise notes that both sample lessons start with a video as a hook. Yes, that's true. And you absolutely do not need to start with a video. It is certainly possible to just have students do a discussion depending on their level, or to use pictures. So we just happened to find videos that worked, so that's what we used. Is everybody still hearing me? Oh, those yeses must be that people can still hear me. Francis says it could be a reading or a discussion for the hook. That's true. It really depends on the level, and really what you're trying to do with that hook is to show students why you're taking up their time teaching it, why it's relevant to their lives, why they would need to use it in their real life. And I think that's really important, because some students don't understand why we're doing something, and we really should be as explicit as possible with why we're choosing to do that. Hopefully what you're choosing are actually things that they've already identified in a needs assessment, but it doesn't hurt to sort of put it in a context for them so that they can see exactly why we're learning it. Simon says, obviously the time needed, number of lessons for preparing students for an assessment task depends on the task and the level, etc. How many practice attempts at similar tasks do you recommend? Very good question, Simon. For me, I'm thinking of, I want to see that the majority of my class has learned these skills and integrated them, so that it's not just sort of, I teach them today and they can do it tomorrow on an assessment. What I'm hoping is that they can do it outside in their real life. So I would want to try to set up practice attempts for them to be trying to demonstrate that it's actually been integrated into their life. And I think you just hit it on the head, that the number really can't sort of be said. It really sort of depends on what you see happening in the class and how students seem to be reacting, whether it's seeming to be more natural for them or whether they're still sort of struggling along with it. Somebody said, for literacy, dialogues or pieces of conversation are great. I'm not sure if that's in reference to the hook or if that's in reference to activities that you can do. But Caroline says, yes, Mary, a visual or picture and questions around it are great for low levels. Or a video without the sound on. Yes, we've often done that with low levels, is to have a video when we play it without the sound, and just prompt from the students what they're seeing. Who's in the video, what are they doing, why are they doing that, and just use that rather than worrying the students with trying to understand the sound. Louise says, what I appreciate is your use of authentic assessment. Yes, this is really a goal, is to always remember that we're not trying to teach the students to do tasks in the classroom. We're trying to teach them to do tasks that they can do outside in their real lives. We think obviously that's what they've come to us for, and that's what we're trying to work towards. So the more, obviously in a classroom, it's not a real life situation. I mean, it's a real life situation, but it's not an outside of class situation. So it can't always be as authentic as we'd like, but we try to make it as authentic as possible. Mary says, ISS has great videos on YouTube. Yes, we do. We had found that it was very difficult to get videos at the right pace for our lower level learners, and so we do have a whole YouTube channel that we put up there free for anybody to use with videos that are appropriate to LINC type of themes and topics. So Mary, how are we doing? It looks like we may be wanting to wrap up. Is that correct?
Yep, we have about 5 more minutes. for any more questions if anyone wants. So we'll just see. Any more questions from anyone? No? Okay. Definitely check out those videos if you need them. They're really good. I've used them in my classes before as well. So thanks to Lisa, Claire, Francis, and Caroline for presenting. And if you guys want to continue this discussion, please join the Realize group on Tutela.